This video will cover what is a function, the definition of a function, different types of functions, and it will also have some examples so you can test your new knowledge. And remember that you can use the timestamps in the description to jump to specific parts in the video. So, what's a function? The short answer is that a function relates an input to an output. And I would like to show you what I mean by making our own. The standard notation for the name of a function is the letter f, and the most used input variable is the letter x. But make sure to remember that you can use whatever letter you would like. The next step is to make some rules for a function. We kind of have to tell it what it should do with the inputs we give it. Let's say that the first rule is that f of x is equal to x plus 1 if x is equal to a number. And my next rule is maybe going to confuse some of you, but just hang on. My next rule is going to be that the function is equal to a triangle if x is equal to a square. I made this rule because I wanted to show you that a function is not only limited to numbers. The input and output could be anything you would like. But what would happen if we, for example, input the number 2 into our function? And the way we would do it would be used to replace our input variable x with our input, the number 2, and check which rule that seems to apply to our input. So let's check the rules. The function is going to give us a triangle if 2 is a square. And the function is going to give us 2 plus 1 if 2 is a number. So, because 2 is a number and not square, the function is going to take the number 2 and add 1, which is equal to the number 3. Let's test one more. What would happen if we input a square into our function? A square is a square and not a number, so the function would give us a triangle back. But remember that the function can only work for inputs that it has a rule for. So if I were, for example, to input a circle into this function, I wouldn't be able to get something out of it, because the function wouldn't know how to handle it. I will continue by describing this function we just did with the help of sets. So, what is a set? A set is kind of like a container. It contains stuff, and the stuff has a more fancy name. They are called elements. And the element could be anything. It could be a number, it could be a color, or just an object. But here in set x, we will have all different inputs to our function. So we'll have one element that is a square, we will have another element that is the number 2, and the third element that is number 3, and so on, until we have all possible inputs to our function in this set. While in the set y, we will have all possible outputs from this function. And in some cases, we'll have even more elements. But what a function really does is that it takes and matches one element in set x to another element in set y, and keeps going until all the elements in set x is matched. And if you take our function as an example, we can see that our function matched the square in the set x to the triangle in the set y, and that it also matched the number 2 to the number 3. And I can promise you that if we had kept going, we would have been able to match each element in set X to another element in set Y. So, lastly I'm going to draw the graph of our function. And the function's graph is actually made up of the sets that define the function. So, our function is between the set X with all the inputs and the set Y with all the outputs. And the way we draw the function is just to look at all the matches the function has done between the two sets and mark them on the graph. I think you are ready now for the definition of a function. A function relates each element in a set to exactly one element in another set. Let's say we have a function here that goes between two sets, the set X to the set Y. And the set X is also called the domain for a function, while the set Y is called the codomain. Let's draw the domain and the codomain to this function. So, the domain might contain two elements, and let's say that the codomain contains 3. A function has to relate each element in the domain to exactly one element in the codomain, but it doesn't have to use every single element in the codomain. In this example, we had that only 2 elements in the codomain were used, and those 2 elements makes up the range for this function. I would like you to test your knowledge by pausing this video and with the help of a definition of function, decide if the relationships you see on your screen are a function or not. So, is the first relationship a function? Let's go to the definition. The definition says that each element has been used in the domain set, that is. If we go to our domain, we see that only 2 out of 3 elements has been used, and therefore is the relationship number 1 not a function. So what about the relationship number 2? We can clearly see that all the elements in the domain has been used. They all relate to something in the codomain, that is. But we can also see that the first element relates to 2 different elements in the codomain. And if we go to the definition, we can clearly see that each element only can relate to exactly one element in the codomain. So, the relationship number 2 is not a function. But what about the third relationship? The last one is actually a function. And the reason for that is that it relates each element in the domain to exactly one element in the codomain. The type of a function tells us a lot about the function itself. That is why we are going to continue by discussing different types of functions. Let's start with defining what's a surjective type function, also called an onto function. A surjective type function has one rule. It has to relate to each element in the codomain, and that's all. Another way to identify this type of function is to count the elements in the domain and in the codomain, because this type of function needs to have the same or more elements in the domain than in the codomain. Another function type is called the injective function, also known by the name one-to-one function. And this type of function cannot relate to the same element in the codomain twice. This type of function also needs to have fewer or the same number of elements in the domain than in the codomain. The last type is called bijective function. And you get a bijective function if the function is both surjective and injective. So the function has to relate to each element in the codomain, but it cannot relate to the same element in the codomain twice. And for a function to be able to be with both at the same time, it needs to have the same number of elements in the domain and in the codomain. So the last example. Please pause the video and decide which type of function this function below is. Let's start by counting how many elements we have in each set. That way we might be able to eliminate some of the types above. So the domain set X only has one element, while the codomain set Y has 4, which means that this function down here could be an injective function. We only have to check if this function fulfills the rules for an injective function. And that rule was that it could not relate to the same element in the codomain twice, which we see down here isn't the case. So our function here below is an injective function.